It is sometimes said that innovation requires one to embrace failure. In the aviation world, that often means kinetic contact with the local geography, often at high speed. Progress is not a given. It requires hard work, a lot of money, maths and clever engineering, and even then it has a distressing tendency to result in a flaming ball of twisted metal. Over many years, the British were renowned for building aircraft in sheds, trying to use duct tape, hope, string and the spare change that they'd found down the back of the seat cushion to produce aircraft that would challenge the world's best. And quite frankly, the end products didn't always work terribly well. Often their primary redeeming feature was a short and fiery service life, but beggars can't be choosers, and so you've got things like the Supermarine Scimitar that managed to kill about half of everyone unlucky enough to be forced to fly in it. The United States has always had a different approach, basically throwing huge piles of money at private contractors to see what interesting things they can come up with. Sometimes you've got brilliant things like the F-15. Other times you've got explodey crashy things like the F-104 Starfighter, the Vought F-7U Cutlass, or the V-22 Osprey. But if one is in search of the truly epic failures of aviation development, then there really is only one country and one time period where politics, engineering and ambition combine to produce the unexpected, the unwanted and the unusable at scale. Hello, my name is Lord Hardthrasher, embodiment of the oppressor class, and you, my little proletarian friend, are either here because someone dropped their copy of Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism onto the keyboard, or because you wish to learn about the Tu-144. A worthy goal for any aspiring revolutionary, to be sure, but as I am a capitalist running dog, I must warn you that if you were hoping for some story that would burnish the glory of the history of the workers' paradise, then you are in for a rude shock. Furthermore, not being a man of the people, whilst I can and will talk about the specifics of the airframe, we will spend a not inconsiderable amount of time talking about the context, the politics, and, delightfully in this case, the espionage, and rather less time considering the specifics of the system. Talking of being a capitalist running dog, let me introduce today's sponsor. Rather delightfully, today's video is sponsored by CyberGhost VPN. Now look, despite her ladyship's rather extensive running costs, I do not, as a rule, accept sponsorship unless I really like what a company does. And CyberGhost VPN are rather brilliant. These chaps have some 38 million users worldwide, and it would seem they keep those users happy as more than 20,000 people have rated them as excellent on Trustpilot. Now you might be saying to yourself, why would I need a VPN? Well, it could just be that you genuinely can't think of a reason, in which case, my sweet summer child, you are probably too innocent to be on the internet. But for the rest of us, we really need that help. From work to school to IT departments to the governments of foreign powers and so on, all watching our every bloody move online, a VPN is a must. For example, for this video, I have had to go onto a variety of exciting Russian websites, and rather than wanting them to know that I'm a visitor from Blighty and thus tripping every bloody alarm in the place, and this is where, by the way, incognito mode just won't cut it, a VPN is needed. CyberGhost VPN lets me don a metaphorical moustache, a string of onions and a beret, and suddenly I'm from France. Mes amis, a quick look at your Tu-144 pictures, s'il vous plaît. Using the same technology, when I want to watch something like, the live Highland Games, which for some bizarre reason is only showing on Sky Sports Mexico, not a problem. CyberGhost VPN works with more than 40 streaming platforms, and has servers in over 100 countries, ready to cater to your every need and want. If you have, as I do, a household filled with different devices, then the good news is, not just is there a version for every operating system, but you can protect up to 7 devices at the same time, which means even Jenkins is allowed to share my subscription, although I shall not ask him exactly what he plans to look at. And ask I would have to do, as CyberGhost VPN doesn't retain logs, so whatever Jenkins browses is essentially between him and God. Assuming that you are good and revved up by this idea, then you should know that CyberGhost VPN is, through the link that you will find in the description, offering you an 84% discount, and you get 4 months for free. And since they have a 45-day money-back guarantee and access to 24/7 customer support, risk is considerably lower than visiting Madame Coucher's House of Charms. So, use the link in the description, get CyberGhost VPN today, and start protecting your digital life right now. To To understand what happened in the 1960s and 1970s over and sometimes into the land of the Soviet Socialist Republics, we need to go back a tiny bit. The Soviet Union did not fly its first jets until 1946, the MiG-9, NATO reporting name Das Reich. Oh wait, no, hang on, no, my mistake, Fargo. This is what became their first production military jet. See, I made a funny there because this was actually a pair of rebadged BMW 003 engines in a sausage suit. The 003 was the engine originally developed to be mounted in the Me-262, but didn't because it wasn't ready in time. It, in fact, narrowly beat into the air the Yak-15, using rebadged Jumo 004s, also engines made for the Me-262. Now, of course, none of this was a huge surprise to anyone that knows their aviation or indeed their Soviet history. A number of former German scientists have all been offered expenses-paid trips to the Soviet Union and given a choice between being tortured to death in the Lubyanka or working for Comrade Stalin to design new planes, or quite often both. With their help and not a little British naivety, the Soviets had managed to catch up with the West in engine design by the mid-1950s, but they remained mostly in the domain of the military sphere. The world's first jet airliner was, famously, the de Havilland DH-106 Comet 1, which flew for the first time in 1949 and entered service in May 1952. With such mod cons as not being a converted bomber, actual seats, a pressurised cabin, and not making its occupants deaf, it was a big hit with the glitterati. Quickly, other manufacturers like Boeing and Lockheed and many others got into the market. Actors, models, millionaires, and even the odd footballer could now hop on a plane and be scooted from point A to point B in a blur of champagne, style, sex appeal, speed, hairspray, aftershave, and relative safety for the first time. The age of the jet set had begun, and this was all good, clean fun. Yes, sometimes they still crashed and killed everybody on board, but honestly, who's counting? You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. In the 1960s in the US, there was something like 100 million passenger journeys done every year. In Europe, partly because of all the different languages, border controls and consequent shag and hassle, it was perhaps 30 million passenger journeys done every year. Meanwhile, in the USSR, it was only about 10 million, despite the USSR being by far the biggest land area of the three. Why the difference there then? Glad you asked. I am often told that the whole of the UK could fit into Texas, and this is not actually true, but nonetheless, the UK is tiny compared to the USA. But in turn, the 48 states bit of the US is considerably less than half the size of Russia, never mind the USSR. The Soviet Union spanned 11 time zones stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Chinese border. With perhaps 200 million people living in the workers' paradise, most of them able to speak at least some Russian, living under one nominal economic system, you might be forgiven for assuming that, a bit like the US, they'd be bang up for air travel. And they were. Kind of. See, in the Soviet Union, whilst obviously you were free to enjoy the fruits of the system in which everyone was free, travel was still considered to be a bit suspect. Unless, of course, you were required to travel by the Soviet state, in which case it was compulsory and you would travel. Look, it was really complicated. On the one hand, you had a select few, often scientists, party oprechniks, the head of industrial sectors and so on, who could travel fairly freely and even leave the USSR and go abroad. On the other hand, you had the mass of the people who were, ideally, not really supposed to go beyond unstated limits of their socialist unit. You couldn't, for example, just get up and leave to move to another city somewhere else. Partly this was good communist ideology, and partly this was paranoid security bullshit, and partly this was the Russian inability to get over things like serfdom. Once you've had a system like that for 1,000 years, it's very, very hard to suddenly start telling people that they can move around. And of course, part of this was just the general Russian approach to making sure that no one can ever have nice things. Internally, if you wanted to move around for business or for pleasure, you needed your propiska, a kind of internal passport document, basically. You want a train ticket? Cool. You show your propiska, you register your reason for travel, make sure that the ticket is a return, hand over your money, and you make sure that the local KGB agent doesn't say no. And once you've done it, you should be absolutely fine, and you could get on that train and come back again. But if you did it too often, you'd certainly be looked at more closely, let's call it that. And the mode of transport you took was as open to ideological questioning as your choice of destination. Trains, for example, were seen as a good proletarian means of transport, and reasonably compromised speed and distance in the workers' ideal, with a lot of steel and coal and everything else being involved, even 1960. But it was slow, delay-prone, and it was subject to a timetable that was essentially a state secret. No, I'm not kidding, by the way. Soviet timetables were not just published to the general public. You had to get special permission to see them. So sometimes you were guessing. If you were Both incredibly lucky and something of an iconoclast. You could maybe drive, but bear in mind only 1 in 10 people had access to a car. And I mean access, I don't mean they owned a car, just that they could get at one. And the word car here is doing some very heavy lifting. If that word somehow conjures up an image of a comfortable vehicle which could accommodate 2 adults, 2 children and their luggage, and do stuff like start and drive up the road or stop, then you are wholly mistaken. The most, I was going to say popular, but let's go with numerous, car in 1960 was the Trabant, specifically the 2-stroke 18 horsepower version. Covering the 10,000 kilometres from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok in one of those doesn't bear thinking about. As a result of all of this, from the 1930s it had been recognised that flying was kind of a necessary evil for the state to function properly, and also for its own prestige. Thus the USSR made a great play pre- and post-war of its advances in civil aviation, with the Tu-144 for example being the first passenger jet, not that many people were allowed on one of course. For all these places, the US, Europe and the USSR, the question at the end of the 1950s was kind of what's next in civil aviation? If you looked at the development of the passenger plane market in, say, 1963, there were basically 2 ways that these things could go. First, championed by significant chunks of upper management in a lot of aviation companies, particularly in the US, was that airlines would want fuel-efficient, mid to high altitude aircraft which could pack punters in like so many sardines, and you wanted a range of planes from transatlantic clippers to domestic 2-engine efforts that all offered comfort levels equivalent to about a flying bus, where speed was less of a priority than cost to both airlines and then ultimately to passengers. This view, which was commonly held across an awful lot of executives in the US, said that there would be a load of people who, for business or for leisure, would like to fly but couldn't because ticket prices were just, but only just, out of reach. Reduce the cost, increase passenger numbers, sell more planes. That was the logic. It makes a lot of sense, especially in a world where flying for business or to see relatives was considered pretty normal, as it was in the US. As we discussed previously, Europe was a slightly different prospect. It was a highly fragmented market with lots of borders, tax rules, languages, security requirements and currencies. Thus, European governments and manufacturers and carriers all concluded that really the only people who would want to fly in the future were the very rich, and they'd want to do it at speed and in luxury. Screw the peasants, add more champagne and engines. And this was, as we know now, monumentally stupid. Cheap and popular would win the day over exclusive and fast, but it does perhaps explain why the British and the French got so far so fast when the US studies into their supersonic transports, or SSTs, done by the likes of Boeing, didn't get serious boardroom or come to that governmental backing, despite grand-sounding statements made intermittently from the mid-1950s. The challenges involved in developing an SST, or a supersonic transport, were significant. Any civilian supersonic program would need engines capable of Mach 2 or greater. They would need to make those engines reliable enough that they could regularly visit those speeds without exploding and without a rebuild being required every few hours. They'd need to be fuel efficient enough to do the job whilst powering a very heavy airframe with lots of squishy humans on board. To make the aircraft economically viable was going to be tricky. It would need space for fuel and at least 100 odd paying passengers, plus their crew, luggage and all the crap they need to eat and drink, and probably fly several thousand miles to make the journey worthwhile, and then do those journeys back to back as regularly as possible. Even Martin Baker didn't make ejection seats capable of pushing out a couple of hundred passengers at a time, so safety was going to be a huge factor, or at least it should have been. The plane would need to fly supersonic, but land obviously much more slowly, and possibly also be able to cruise over civilian population centres without sonic booms that would break everybody's windows, and the engines would need to be quiet enough to make them socially acceptable. But designing control surfaces capable of high and low speeds in flight like that, with all that stuff on board, was not going to be straightforward. And added to this was the materials challenge. Going at Mach 2 at say 55,000 feet meant that the air outside might be minus 30 degrees centigrade, whilst the aircraft's skin temperature could well be at over 100 degrees. Enough certainly to kill the occupants and make the plane stretch a few feet if you couldn't cool it down. That meant finding the right materials for the body and the windows, light enough to do the job, strong enough to cope with repeated heating and freezing, flexible enough to be able to cope with the movement. It was not going to be straightforward. In fact, everything on this plane was going to need to be very, very light. Each pound of weight added meant less speed and less range, and therefore less economic viability. Most critical to all of this was, of course, the wing shape. Swing wings were probably too complex, too heavy, and too unreliable, so probably a delta wing was the only way to go forward, although one should note that at one point Boeing was seriously looking at a swing wing aircraft. Given that the plane needed to be able to fly in lots of different conditions, at different speeds, with different fuel loads, and it would probably be inherently hard to handle, advanced avionics would be required, built around computers reliable enough for passengers to be able to rely on them. None of this was going to be easy. Somewhat to everyone's surprise and confusion, it was the British and the French who got there first. They teamed up on a project which became known as Concorde in 1960, announcing Sud Aviation, which would have later become Aerospatiale, and the recently formed British Aircraft Corporation, or BAC, would get the plane in service by 1970. This profoundly shocked the US public, US Congress, and key players in the US aerospace market, not least because their premier carrier, Pan Am, had bought an option on flying Concordes. BAC was talking about making hundreds of these aircraft over the next decade. Boeing and Lockheed were passing bricks. What if they got this whole cheap flight things wrong? What if speed really was crucial to the market? Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into the decade between 1960 and 1970 and the failed development of the United States SST programs, but it was pretty sordid stuff. Having for years told the world that competition was good, when actual competition showed up, the US was none too happy. A rather ugly period followed in which United States legislators and manufacturers did their best to stop SSTs flying over the US, unless of course they were American made. The process of building a supersonic airliner was, as we've just noted, not fucking easy, but trying to do that in the Soviet Union was akin to playing Dark Souls on NG7+. Constant political interference, the comparatively crude manufacturing base in the USSR, a fear of the new, a bureaucratic mess of committees and subcommittees, multiple design bureaus, a lack of raw materials, and the weird Soviet mindset was not going to be conducive to producing a complicated, innovative aviation project. Although less bloodthirsty by far than it had been in the 1930s, navigating the Soviet system required an ambitious designer to do a few things all at once. Firstly, some instigating external factor had to fire the whole system into gear. Typically this would be a new multi-year plan or some Western prestige project which stung people into action. And then of course you needed patronage, typically from someone older than you, and only then did you need an idea to pitch. Young designers walked a tightrope of, on the one hand, not suggesting something that was radical and different, but on the other hand, demonstrating their commitment to the regime by suggesting the radical and the different. Too much of the former, and you could be accused of anti-Soviet activities or lack of revolutionary zeal, whereupon you could be denounced, demoted, possibly arrested, and sent to the gulags. Too much of the latter, and you could be accused of anti-Soviet activities or lack of revolutionary zeal, whereupon you could be denounced, demoted, possibly arrested, and sent to the gulags. The best bet then was to gather your support and wait for some other poor sap to suggest an idea, do all of the hard yards and take all of the political risks before you popped up denouncing their project as revisionist or whatever, proposing your idea whilst being sure to emphasise where your political support came from. Of course, this wasn't without risk. They could fire back using their patronage, and this could go several rounds before a winner emerged. If you weren't super careful, this might also become an escalatory cycle which would see you win, in inverted commas, but actually lumbered with some bonkers project with impossible expectations and a huge amount of eyes on you. In the early 1950s, the idea of building a Soviet SST had percolated gently through Moscow's academic circles, but no one had taken it too seriously. That changed when the Anglo-French teaming agreement was announced. In 1960, Sergei Ilyushin approached the Ministry of Aviation with two potential designs. The ministry looked at both, laughed and walked off. But this wasn't the end of the matter. As the British and the French got more serious, so the pressure to do something grew. Andrei Tupolev knew a thing or two about how to operate in this system, having survived for 4 years at Stalin's pleasure in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So he rolled up in 1962 saying words to the effect of, "Ilyushin is a fine institution filled with revolutionary zeal, but was not Comrade Sergei already distracted by his Il-8 turboprop, and of course his Il-38 anti-submarine aircraft, and his Il-62 prototype? And of course, they didn't have the experience with large supersonic aircraft before. No, what was needed was something made by a research bureau with the time, experience and know-how to do the project properly, comrades." And what about comrades OKB-156? After all, they built the world's first supersonic bomber and are currently working on the next generation of supersonic standoff bombers, ready to spread the people's will across the decadent West. Oh, gosh, would you look at that? OKB-156? That would be my organisation. What are the chances? Anyway, here are some drawings that the boys in the office have come up with. In July 1963, the Ministry of Aviation agreed with Andrei and they charged Tupolev with creating something to beat Concorde into the air with, which meant a prototype would need to be airworthy by the end of 1968 and service should begin the following year in 1969. That gave him and his team just 4.5 years to go from paper study to plane and just 5 to start getting passengers up the steps. On the face of it, this was pretty much the same timescale as Concorde had laid out, and it looked maybe reasonable, but it's worth bearing in mind that the British and the French had actually been working on feasibility studies for an SST since 1957. They had 2 years of paper studies in the bag by this point, and they had production facilities on both sides of the channel, basically ready to go. The British TSR-2 programme had given BAC insights into high-speed flight, automation, engines, navigation systems, aluminium alloys, titanium handling, multi-domain wing loading, project planning, and a whole bunch of other things. The Soviets were at a serious disadvantage in almost all of these fields, with the exception of handling titanium. Although Tupolev would be the lead design house to overcome the gap, support would be needed from across the USSR. In theory, this is where a collective economy should shine. In practice, this was where the nightmare of red tape, personal ambition, jealously guarded secrets, state committees and backstabbing would manifest themselves. One might assume, not unreasonably, that the Tu-144 could have been based on one of the existing supersonic bomber programs, but what became apparent quickly, both in the East and in the West, was that whilst supersonic passenger planes might have military uses, a military plane converted to civil use was, well, basically useless. They were not reliable enough, big enough, efficient enough, and critically comfortable enough to be able to be made to work. Plus, there were loads of systems that you wouldn't hopefully need, like ECM, for example, that would need to be ripped out. The conversion job was essentially going to be more costly than just starting again. This meant a wholly new plane was designed from the ground up, with a little bit of help from the KGB, which we'll come to in a minute, at exactly the wrong moment in Soviet history, because in 1964, barely a year into the project, Leonid Brezhnev became General Secretary of the Politburo and the most powerful man in the USSR, having ousted Khrushchev in a bloodless coup. The chairman is retiring due to ill health. Long live the chairman. Brezhnev would outlast Johnson, Nixon, Ford and Carter and was still in power when Ronald Reagan took the US throne. He would oversee a stultifying, glacially slow-moving state that valued age and stability and the safe over innovation and change. By the time he was done, the average age of the Politburo members was over 75. This meant two things for Tupolev Design Bureau. Firstly, a lot of their political support and contacts suddenly disappeared in a puff of smoke. And secondly, Andrei was suddenly carrying a highly innovative project in a state which, under Leonid, would focus on the conservative and the safe. In other words, there was a sodding great big target on his head, and his design team's head as well. If there were problems and flaws, there would be temptation to ignore them, to cover them up, and generally pretend that everything was fine and move on. And this isn't great on a project as complicated and as risky as a Tu-144. As I said at the start of this, I'm not going to try and cover every aspect of the Tu-144 in minute detail, but rather I'm going to pick out some high, or rather I should say, lowlights. There were never many Tu-144s made. In fact, there were just 16, including prototypes. In a turn of events which I am quite sure will shock everyone, it turns out that a lot of the statistics that are available online regarding the 144 are, well, untrue. Actually, that's not quite fair. Let me explain. There were actually 2 prototypes that were built, and they were there to test the design and prove that the thing could fly, and most importantly of all, of course, hit the 1968 takeoff date. Why were there 2 and not 1? Well, because one of them crashed, killing 2 members of the crew, because of course it did, so they had to build a second one. These were slightly shorter, had slightly smaller wingspans and a much thinner body. Performance stats for these are all over the bloody shop, not least because the second one became a test mule for different engines, configurations and even fuel types, so you have to know when it was flying and how it was set up before you look the numbers up. Suffice to say for now that we can conclude that both of them could break the speed of sound, but by how much? Hard to exactly know, and it's not particularly relevant when we're talking about the aircraft as it became. Then you have the Tu-144S, which actually carried passengers, of which there were 9 made, and then you have 5 Tu-44Ds, and we'll get to the differences between those two things in a tick. Statistics generally quoted by, for example, Wikipedia are there for the later D model. This is fine, but it never carried passengers, so it doesn't, in my opinion, really count. Also, a lot of the stats out there are just plain misleading. For example, quoting, range numbers that assume unladen flights, or seat numbers that were theoretical but were never actually used, and so on and so on and so on. Trying to understand the real world application and the real world figures for the Tu-144 takes a bit more research. To try and make this fair, I will use the most flattering statistics for the Model S when comparing it to the D or to Concorde, and I'll try and explain the caveats I found along the way. On the paper, the Tu-144S was supposed to be able to carry 120 passengers at Mach 2.2 and could fly at 60,000 feet. To get there, it was powered by 4 Kuznetsov NK144A turbofan engines. It was 215 feet long and it was just under 95 feet from wingtip to wingtip. This made it able to carry more passengers, fly higher, fly faster, and was bigger than Concorde. In reality, it couldn't really do any of those things, at least not without risking catastrophic failure. For example, it never flew with more than 90 passengers on board. I also need to point out that Andrei Tupolev was in his dotage when he got this project, and he was gravely ill for most of the 144 program. He died in 1972 during the development of the D version. Andrei was a practical, experienced engineer who wanted rigorous testing. His son, Alexei, acted as his father's right-hand man and was, in effect, the chief designer, but he was all about innovation and change, and he was also under a huge amount of political pressure. He was simply not up to the standards of his old man. This duopoly saw both 80 test rigs built to examine things down to the last detail on, for example, the fuel system, but it also saw sign-off on some really fucking stupid decisions. Take, for example, the air conditioning system, or ACS. Not exactly a radical system on most planes, but in the Tu-144 and indeed in SSTs, it was vital. With a boundary layer of air in front of the aircraft that would heat up to well north of 150 degrees centigrade, the skin temperatures of the plane would be between 100 and 120 degrees centigrade, and the passengers and crew would be cooked pretty quickly without a decent aircon system to cool them and, of course, the delicate electronics down. The system that Tupolev Design Bureau adopted basically created a rigid fiberglass shell around the pressurized cabin area with a lot of small holes in it, and then it took air from the engine intakes, passed it over a series of 6 heat exchangers and blew it around this fiberglass layer, cooling down both the skin and the cabin simultaneously. To move that air around, obviously it needed a lot of empty space to move through. It was, in principle, a bloody clever system, but it was also actually insanely stupid. To see why, we need to look quickly at Concorde, where this same issue had been solved using 3 different systems. Firstly, BAC came up with a bit of a genius idea, which on the face of it looks kind of nuts, and that is to use the fuel as a heatsink. If it was handled carefully, the fuel, which started at about minus 50 degrees centigrade when it was stored, could be passed through heat exchangers before being burnt. For reasons that are very unclear, this approach never appears to have occurred to Tupolev. Secondly, by using glass wool or protective heat mats to insulate the cabin from the skin, the cabin temperature was more easily maintained, and the environmental controls bleeding air from the engines kept the temperature comfortable inside the cabin for humans and electronics. The net result was a light, effective system that also helped to insulate the cabin from noise. Someone somewhere in Tupolev had done some mathematics and thought that in order to keep the skin temperature down without their funky fiberglass bubble, you'd need to use a lot of heat-proof matting, essentially assuming that the only alternative was to let the skin get hot and stop the cabin pressure getting hot by putting some heavy-duty insulating substance in the way, and the emphasis here was on heavy. They would have added some 20 tons in weight, or so their calculations said, and they were already 20% overweight, so this was not possible. Now, all of this maths might be right, but it wasn't the only option, as demonstrated by Concorde's design. Essentially what they created was a false dichotomy here. And the obvious problem that some of you may already have spotted is that this Tupolev tube fixation ignored a key factor in civil aviation, the civil bit, the passengers. The engines on the Tu-144S were close inboard, tucked up hard against the fuselage, with intakes that extended along the whole length of the wing. On the D, these were pushed out from the body a bit, but they were still there with huge long air intakes that, from an engineering perspective, didn't actually do a lot. On the S, the engines had to be kept in constant reheat to maintain supersonic cruise. We'll come back to that in a second. But all of this meant a huge amount of noise and vibration was being generated essentially next to the passenger cabin. And thanks to this clever ACS design, there was now no insulation from the noise. The result was, when passengers finally flew on board, they had to communicate via handwritten notes saying, one assumes things like, "Bloody hell, I can hardly hear myself plot the downfall of the Soviet Union in here." Talking of wings, obviously we need to address the elephant, or I suppose more accurately the double delta in the room. At first glance, Concorde and Concordeski wings are basically the same, which is true in that both of them were delta wings. But whether this was a basic idea forced by the engineering or whether the KGB had had a hand in it, and we'll explore that more a little bit later, it's worth saying that not all delta wings are created equal. The Tu-144s used a thing called a double delta. That's a sort of skinny bit before a less skinny bit, which looks a bit different in profile. The wing design sucked arse on multiple levels. When you put it next to Concorde, you can see how crude it looks. It was much thicker, it created a load of drag. The whole wing had to be curved much more dramatically. It was basically shit at low speeds, meaning that there had to be a very high takeoff and landing speed, in excess of 180 miles an hour. That in turn meant that the whole plane had to be canted up on its nose, hence that heron-like front gear assembly and that squat rear gear. The Tu-144 had a weirdly long butt, and so working in conjunction with this canted up design and this weird wing, as it took off it regularly scraped its ass along the asphalt, necessitating an armoured belt and probably causing quite a lot of poo to come out from various members of the passengers and crew when they heard it. To compensate for the poor lift, the designers did what good aircraft designers often do and resorted to canards. From 1973, the S and the D models had what amounted to a slightly shit swing wing up front, which looks absolutely bobbins. A bit like me trying to make something out of wood and realising I've made a mistake, the Soviet designers just sort of screwed them into the hull, squeezing an area behind the cockpit just enough to about fit them in, kind of. The designers were actually jolly proud of these things, pointing at the tiny wee wings had front slats so beloved of modern aircraft like the Me-109 or the Sabre, as well as the double set of flaps which could extend. What they failed to mention was that A, these were only necessary because of the shit wing design, and B, they regularly flew off in flight, spraying fragments of metal around the place which would inevitably find its way into the engine intakes and cause emergencies. Reliability plummeted after these things were fitted due to all the incidents. The original specification for the Tu-144 had been to provide for about 4,000 miles of range, a useful figure when flying across the Soviet Union, albeit a much smaller number than Concorde's 7,200 kilometres. I hinted at the problem a minute ago. The engines were not... what's the word I'm hunting for here? Oh yes, good. As ever with Soviet design, in part they were visionary and in part they were utterly crap. Right at the start, Tupolev had decided that he wanted to use turbofan engines, seeing these as the future of highly efficient high-speed flight. And they weren't wrong in this. Turbofans would indeed go on to dominate high-speed flight. However, the turbofans that they had at home were the Kuznetsov NK-144s, which, and I know this will shock fans of the Soviet Union and aviation fans alike, it turned out that these engines could not produce anything like as much power as had been suggested at the design phase. Thus, they had to be kept in reheat in order to maintain supersonic cruise. And for those that are perhaps a little less familiar with what that means, basically reheat or afterburners, depends where you are and what your preferred term is where you blow neat fuel into the hot exhaust of the engine, which then ignites and kind of therefore the engine burns twice. It's very effective for generating power, but it's highly fuel inefficient, although it does look cool as fuck. It's also noisy as fuck. A huge test program, which continued until May 1975 to try and fix the issues with the NK-144s, was then abandoned. The net result of the shit wings and the shit engines was a range of no more than 3,000 kilometres, less than half of Concorde's, whilst carrying the same number of passengers. For the Tu-144D, or long range, there was a switch from the KN engines to the Kolosov RD-3651s, which were ironically a set of turbojets without afterburners, essentially going back in time to go forward. These did improve the range up to about 6,000 kilometres in theory, at the cost of a lower top speed just over Mach 2. In practice, they proved to be a mobile disaster zone, with a tendency to rip themselves from anything else that was close to them apart, resulting in multiple engine fires on the ground and indeed in the air. They were never used with paying passengers. Another problem with the engines, especially on the S model where those exhausts were tucked up close to the fuselage and constantly in reheat, meant that there were exhaust gases at about 1600 degrees centigrade that was licking the tail section the whole time. This was, to use an engineering term, fucking dangerous. To compensate, Tupolev eventually settled on a titanium heat shield covering the rear section of the plane, which didn't exactly help with the range issues. Actually, materials problems were a real issue throughout. Back in 1964, the British had found on the TSR-2 certain aluminium alloys which theoretically offered lightness and strength, in fact became hugely brittle and costly whilst offering no discernible benefits. As a result, for Concorde, BAC avoided such weird and wonderful alloys from the back of the sales catalogue. The Soviets, however, trod straight into this bear trap, selecting a particularly interesting alloy, the somewhat ironically named AK-41. Huge efforts across the Soviet Union were made to master rolling, milling and handling of AK-41, including dedicated lathes and jigs and presses and half a dozen factories. And it turned out it was dog shit. AK-41 cracked and shattered with alarming regularity, and the large, stretched skin, which sat over struts not unlike those found on a World War II plane, had no ripstops built in, so once a crack started, it just spread and spread. Inspections of airframes showed nose-to-tail cracks developing, and it's almost certain that that played into what happened next. At the very end of 1968, a thing which looked like the Tu-144S, fitted with a special set of ejector seats for the flight crew, taxied to the end of the runway, fired up its engines, took off, and apparently broke the sound barrier ahead of Concorde's first flight 6 months later. Big tick, job done, well done. Now to build the production aircraft. Except, it was still unspeakably dangerous, and everyone knew it. This was demonstrated in practical terms in 1973. As Concorde was going to go to the Paris Air Show that year, then goddammit, so was a Tu-144S, whereupon it exploded mid-flight, killing 6 occupants and 8 people on the ground. Exactly what happened is still unclear. A joint French-Soviet investigation committee blamed the pilot, but footage clearly shows the plane breaking up in mid-air. Rumours about flight control problems or a Mirage jet in the area offered a fig leaf for what was almost certainly a catastrophic materials failure. Despite this, the programme pushed ahead and got approval for civil aviation use in the USSR. And that sounds good, right? But do just bear in mind that until 1967 there hadn't been any approval in the Soviet Union for civil aircraft. Basically, if it flew and someone was dumb enough to climb on board, then technically you were good to go. Whilst they brought some requirements in during the 70s, compared to the 5,000 hours of certification testing that Concorde went through, it was a pretty shonky process, and success was largely based on political support for the project over any safety concerns. Serious concerns were still swarming around the project out of public gaze. In fact, such was the lack of confidence in the aircraft that when it first began to do a regular once-a-week service, flying to Kazakhstan, it was limited to cargo, and that didn't start till 1977, years after it had gone into production. The schedule said that it would fly once a week, but of course it didn't, because actually it developed so many technical faults that more than half the flights were cancelled, and when it did fly, it often didn't make it. It suffered more than 80 serious technical failures in 180 hours of flight history. Oh, and more than 220 minor faults as well. The de-icers would fail, the cooling system leaked, as did the fuel lines, the electrics shorted, the nose wouldn't bend when it should or did when it shouldn't. The little slow-speed canards fell off, the parachutes sometimes didn't open on landing. The parachute's there, of course, to compensate for the fact that neither engine actually had a reverse thrust setting. Basically, this thing was always one step from killing everybody on board. But the good news was, if you did die, your luggage would be absolutely fine because it couldn't carry both passengers and their suitcases. The suitcases had to come on a separate flight or be delivered by train. Eventually, it was allowed to take passengers, but it only flew 55 times before a crash in 1978, which killed all 109 people on board, put an end to it. It was quietly withdrawn from civilian service and put back into cargo, but after 18 months it was then dropped from even doing that. In all, it carried just 3,284 passengers, but it did only kill 3% of them, so I guess that's good. I mean, it's not quite the 2.5 million passengers that Concorde carried, but I suppose it's a lot more than the Boeing 2707. The total project cost is not known, but Concorde cost about $1.2 billion in 1976, so it would not be unreasonable to assume that the Soviet program was in that order of magnitude, and if so, it was by far the most expensive aviation project that the Soviet Union ever undertook. It sucked in effort and energy from across the Warsaw Pact, causing multiple projects to be cancelled or delayed, and in the end it achieved nothing of any note. And we could leave the Tu-144 story there, but despite everything I've just said about how different it was from Concorde, I mean, just look at it. It does look similar. The name Concordeski is not unreasonable. And we could, of course, put this down to basic engineering and move on with our lives. Or I could use this as an excuse to talk about KGB's Line X. So that's what we're going to do. A quick glance at the shape of the two aircraft side by side does kind of support the theory that the Soviets rummaged through the parts bin out the back of Sud Aviation and BAC and sort of threw their plane together based on that. And whilst the Soviet Union was keen on performative examples of brilliance of communism, for example sending athletes to the Olympics with suspiciously hairy backs, or making wild claims about their latest fighter to scare the West, or boasting about production figures or whatever, the reality was, as the Cold War went on, they knew they were falling badly behind in the technology race. They could still make the odd brilliant thing, but for every clever titanium press you got, you also got a MiG-32BN tearing itself apart in flight, or you got a T-72 replete with poor armour and self-ejecting turret. In the 1960s and 70s, the USSR was a little bit like a neighbour who's lost their job and is trying to use their credit card to compensate so that no one notices. Internal borrowing, corruption, organised crime, a reliance on past triumphs were all increasingly used to try and prop things up. At some point, 1989 as it turned out, the bill would come due. However, one area for all of its inefficiencies continued to be a success for the Soviet Union, and that of course was the KGB. Responsible for both internal and external security, by 1980 it had over 700,000 people on the books, dwarfing the CIA, FBI, MI5 and DGSE combined. Trying to understand this vast structure was a job that kept full-time CIA staffers in full-time substance abuse, and we don't need to dwell too deeply on exactly what everything does. For our purposes, we can simply note that it had multiple directorates with different areas of responsibility, and that the first directorate was focused on foreign intelligence gathering. The first directorate, in turn, had a number of sub-directorates, including one called Directorate T, which was more commonly referred to as Line X. These boys and a few girls were responsible specifically for science and technology intelligence, or S&T. It's not an exaggeration to say that Line X was the means by which Soviet industry continued to suck in air during the latter half of the Cold War, and that without it, the Warsaw Pact might well have collapsed much earlier. A Pentagon assessment in 1980 assessed that 70% of all Warsaw Pact technology, from weapons to television sets, was based on stolen Western IP, a lot of it from the US. This guess turned out actually to be pretty much bob on. In 1992, a chap called Vasily Mitrokhin defected to the United Kingdom with the help of British SIS, and he brought with him the entire KGB First Directorate archives from the mid-1930s to 1984. Mitrokhin's files confirmed the scale and depth of Soviet penetration in S&T, with hundreds of thousands of pages of technical documents passing back between Moscow and the West. The files show that in 1980, 61.5% of all Soviet scientific and technical espionage came from the US. Let me put that a slightly different way. By 1980, US technology actually underpinned the weapons and economies of both sides of the Cold War. Having these files then is great and it's fascinating, but it's a little bit like looking through the contents of a locked room by looking through the keyhole. We know stuff was stolen, but we don't know exactly what they stole, and we probably never will. Sometimes we can take an educated guess at the identities of the spies that are named. Sometimes they were caught and sometimes they faded into obscurity, and all we have is a codename. And this is where things start to get fruity. We know for certain that some KGB agents in embassies took advantage of the system. When Oleg Gordievsky, who later defected to the West, was based in London, he regularly saw agents reporting data back to the centre in Moscow, made up from largely publicly available information. For example, reading an opinion column, rewriting that up in the form of a report from a fake agent, and taking the money that was then sent by the KGB centre, as well as the kudos which would follow. Furthermore, all intelligence agencies have to be able to cope with a certain number of fantasists and dreamers who claim to have access to the very secrets of the heart of government or whatever, but simply make stuff up they think that their handlers will want to hear. And so, whilst we know for sure that there were very real, very dangerous, very active agents out there working for the Soviets, we also can't guess as to how much of what was getting reported back was real and how much of it was being made up. So this makes it very hard to know how much of what follows was real and how much was bullshit. I can only tell you what Moscow Centre thought that it knew, which is that Line X had something like 500 agents in Western Europe, another 120 odd in the US in 1970. Most relevant to our story today is the specific examples of what was going on in the UK and France. In 1970, it was thought that the KGB was running something in the order of 100 agents in the UK. Amongst these agents was one codenamed Ace. He worked for the British Aircraft Corporation, or BAC, that's the firm that was responsible for developing Concorde, and he was there from about 1967, we think. Ace was reputed to have passed about 90,000 pages of technical documents and flight simulation data relating to multiple programs, presumed to have included Concorde, in return for about £300 a month. That's about £2,000 in modern money. In 2023, Ivor James Gregory, who died in 1982, was named as Agent Ace. But another man, Jimmy Doyle, gave an interview to the BBC in 1971, which was suppressed at the time, in which he claimed to have passed information to the Soviets too, and he could also have been Ace. Neither man was ever prosecuted. The archives show that there were at least 10 other agents controlled by Line X in the UK at the end of 1969, although how many of them were involved in aerospace, we're not quite sure. The British had, by 1972, however, had enough of this crap, and aided by a high-ranking Soviet defector, Oleg Lalin, they managed to launch something called Operation Foot. In one swift move, Prime Minister Ted Heath expelled 105 Soviet citizens from the UK overnight. It decimated at a stroke the entire KGB network in the UK, a blow from which they never recovered. France had similar problems, but on a larger scale, and I'd love to elucidate here, but we're running out of time. Suffice to say that at various points the KGB was convinced that it had control over the president's attitude to the US, NATO, the UK, the EU, and various other things, which it probably didn't actually have control of. In 1976, they managed to plant bugs on all of the teleprinters in the French embassy in Moscow so that they could read the traffic in clear text going in and out. Oh, and at least 3 senior intelligence agents for the French turned out to have been working for the KGB in the mid-1970s, one of whom then shot himself. More relevantly here, Line X had 2 agents, Laurent and Drogin, who've never been identified, and they were passing high-level aeronautical information to the centre in Moscow from at least 1967 to 1975 before they were shut down. Exactly why they shut down is a little bit unclear. They may have simply retired, or they may have been caught, or they've decided enough was enough. It's worth bearing in mind that typically French agents were a bit older, most of them having served in the Second World War as part of the communist resistance, and then subsequently being recruited in about 1949. And now we depart into what I call the speculation zone. This is the bit where I try to make some educated guesses as to what the hell happened, because the surprising thing isn't perhaps that the KGB stole records from the West to help develop the Tu-144, but rather that despite doing this, the plane remained so utterly irredeemably crap. A quick review of the timeline is kind of helpful here. Research for the British SST, or Supersonic Transport, began back in 1957. In 1963, the Anglo-French project was confirmed, and Concorde first flew in 1969, with the production aircraft, which were greatly improved and massively changed, getting into the air in 1973. It then took another 2.5 years to achieve airworthiness certification before entering regular service in 1976. In other words, Operation Foot hit Line X agents smack in the middle of this period. The Tu-144 flew right at the end of 1968. It went into production in 72, and its first cargo flights started in 75. It first flew passengers in November 77. Lawrence, Ace and Dargin only really came onto stream in the mid to late 1960s. Whilst this was early enough to have had some influence on the early design elements, certainly the tail assembly of the Tu-144 looks almost identical to Concorde prototypes, a lot of the fundamental elements of the aircraft would have been laid time by the time this information got through. I suspect, but obviously can't prove, that Line X efforts would have been little help in resolving the fundamental issues on the Tu-144. That said, if you'll allow me to depart even further from the supportable facts, then I should probably just point out that rumours have speculated for years that MI5 or MI6 or DGSE collaborated on passing Line X doctored information to make the Tu-144 crapper than it already was. On the face of it, this seems pretty wild, but we know that it did happen at other times during the Cold War. For example, the CIA caused a series of massive Soviet oil fires on pipelines by ensuring that the KGB got corrupted computer code for impellers on an early version of a Stuxnet type attack. Certainly, the choice of AK-41 as an alloy seems extremely odd given British experience on TSR-2, which, if Ace was passing data over, would surely have been amongst the key findings of the by then cancelled project. But that's espionage. Nothing is certain, everything can be questioned, and the results are often, frankly, much less dramatic than one might hope. Okay, diversion over. I think we're done.
Well, we've reached the end of our time together, but as Jenkins requires another 60 seconds to complete a task I've set him, I must fill for a moment or two. Let me therefore remind you about today's sponsor, CyberGhost VPN, who are offering you an 84% discount, a 45-day money-back guarantee, and will help you stay private, stay secure, and unlock global content if you just click on the link in the description of this video. Be a good sport and help a chap out, will you? I would, naturally, also encourage you to join the Hellfire Club on Patreon for a mere £5 a month, which will grant you access to Jenkins's potting shed on Discord and early access to these videos. However, should your mean-spiritedness, failure to use contraception correctly, or your term as an indentured servant, or indeed your incarceration in the workhouse, mean such financial contributions are beyond you, then merely clicking the like and subscribe button or leaving a comment is immensely helpful to me and wholly free to you. Right, well, with any luck, Jenkins is away from the scene by now, and as law enforcement haplessly moves towards his former location, he and I can pop off down the Chain and Gate pub there to see Harry the dog, to move a few hot items tout sweet, as they say on the roads. And therefore I must leave you, my lords, my ladies, my lovely maybes. I bid thee adieu for today.